People will tell you very confidently that what's between the magnets is a magnetic field. And they'll say it as if that explains something. But that doesn't really explain anything. It's just a name. It's like saying there's greenness between two green objects. All right, fine, but what is that supposed to mean in the world? So let's slow down and be honest. You take two magnets, you bring them close, they pull or they push. Something is happening in the space between them. You can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't scoop it into a jar, but it has consequences you can measure. A force shows up on another magnet. A compass needle turns. Iron filings jump around like they've been startled. Now the usual picture they show you is a bunch of curved lines in space. Pretty lines, symmetric. They look like hair combed by a careful person. But those lines aren't really there. Nobody ever found one under a microscope. They're drawings, they're bookkeeping, they're a way of keeping track of how something would push on something else if you put it there. The lines don't do anything. They don't pull, they don't push. So if you stop there and say, that's what's between the magnets, you haven't actually told me what's going on. Here's the real puzzle. A magnet on the table can affect another magnet across empty space. No air required, no contact. Put the whole thing in a vacuum, same result. So whatever is between them isn't air, and it isn't some invisible rope either. If you imagine a rope, you immediately want to ask what the rope is made of and how it knows when to pull and when to push. That picture collapses as soon as you touch it. Try a concrete experiment. Put a compass on the desk, move a magnet nearby, the needle turns, now remove the magnet. The needle goes back. The compass is responding to something in the space where the magnet was. Not where it is now, where it was before, so that something must be able to change and the compass must be able to detect it or sprinkle iron filings on a piece of paper over a magnet. They line up in a pattern, not because they love art, because each little filing becomes a tiny magnet itself and feels forces from its neighbors. You're seeing a collective response to something you still haven't touched. This is where people usually say, well, the magnet creates a magnetic field in space. And again, that's not wrong, but it's not satisfying. It sounds like a thing, but it behaves more like a rule. A rule that says, if you put a magnet or a moving charge here, this is how it will be pushed. One fellow who took this seriously was Michael Faraday. He didn't like action at a distance any more than you should. He imagined space itself being in a certain condition. Not filled with stuff exactly, but not empty either. A condition that could change from point to point and time to time. But now we're in dangerous territory, because the moment you say space has a condition, you want to know what space is made of. And that question doesn't have a comfortable answer. So the honest situation is this. Between the magnets, there is something real enough to store energy, to move things, to change with time. But it's not a substance, not a force by itself, and not just a picture in a book either. And once you accept that strange middle ground, the next question becomes unavoidable. How does this something carry energy and momentum across empty space without being a thing you can grab? A very common dodge at this point is to say, well, magnets are special. They're just weird. End of story. That's not an explanation. That's surrender. Because the same something in space shows up the moment you run a current through a wire. No magnet at all. Just electrons drifting along like tired commuters. Put a compass near the wire and the needle swings. So now the space around the wire has changed its behavior too. That already tells you something important. Whatever is between the magnets isn't exclusive to magnets. It shows up whenever charges move, and that's a big clue. Take a straight wire, run current upward. The compass doesn't point toward the wire or away from it. It turns sideways. That's strange. If this were a simple push or pull, you'd expect something radial, like gravity, but it curls around the wire instead. The effect has a direction built into it. Space now cares about orientation. People invent a rule for this. Point your thumb, curl your fingers, and so on. Fine, the rule works, but again, rules don't explain why space behaves that way. They just tell you how to predict what will happen. Here's a more unsettling experiment. Turn the current on, the compass moves. Turn the current off, the compass moves back. That change didn't happen instantly everywhere. If you were very far away and very patient, you could measure a delay. The change in the condition of space travels at a finite speed, the same speed as light, as it turns out. Now pause and think about that. If nothing were really happening in space, there would be nothing to travel. A rule doesn't propagate. A picture doesn't propagate. Something physical is changing from point to point, carrying information that the current has changed. This is where James Clerk Maxwell comes in, not as a magician, but as a stubborn accountant. He asked what equations would describe these changes consistently. When he did the bookkeeping honestly, the equations said something shocking. Changing electric effects create magnetic effects, and changing magnetic effects create electric ones. Space can support a self-sustaining dance. If you jiggle charges back and forth, the disturbance doesn't stay put. It marches outward. No wire required, no magnet required, just empty space carrying a pattern. We later gave that marching pattern a name, light. So now the question, what's between the magnets, has sharpened. Whatever it is, it can store energy. It can move momentum around. It can wiggle and propagate, and it doesn't need matter to do it. But calling it an electromagnetic field still feels like a trick with words. Is the field a thing, or just a very clever way of talking about how charges and magnets influence each other? That question gets uncomfortable fast, because the answer depends on what you're willing to call real. And that's where the trouble really begins. Here's a blunt fact. The space around a magnet contains energy, not metaphorically, literally. You can calculate how much, and you can make it do work. Bring two magnets together slowly while holding them apart. Your hands feel resistance. Energy is being stored as you fight the attraction. Let go, and that stored energy comes back out as motion. If the energy weren't in the space between them, where exactly was it hiding? You can't put it in the magnets alone. Move them farther apart and the energy changes. Keep the magnets fixed and alter the space, for example, by changing the current in a nearby wire, and the energy changes again. So whatever carries that energy depends on position in space itself. Here's another concrete example. A loop of wire sits near a magnet. You move the magnet. A current flows in the wire. Stop moving the magnet, the current stops. Nothing touched the wire. No particles jumped the gap. Yet energy moved from your hand through space into electrons in the wire. If space were just an empty stage, this would be impossible. So now you might say, fine, space isn't empty. It has properties. But properties of what? This is where people historically went off the rails and invented substances. Ether, jelly filling the universe, mechanical gears at every point. All nonsense, because the moment you give space a material structure, you predict effects that don't show up. Drag, preferred directions, wind. Nature refuses to cooperate. So we're stuck with something that acts like a physical system, but doesn't behave like matter. It has energy, momentum, and stress. You can push on it. It can push back, but you can't grab it, weigh it, or point to its pieces. That makes people uncomfortable, so they retreat to safer language. They say the field is just a mathematical construct, but that's also unsatisfying. Mathematics doesn't knock compasses sideways. Equations don't carry energy across a vacuum. Here's a test I like. Suppose you put energy somewhere, and later that energy shows up somewhere else. If you can track how long it takes and how it flows through space, you're allowed to say something real traveled. And that's exactly what electromagnetic fields do. They carry energy with a speed, a direction, and a density you can calculate and measure. In fact, you can compute the energy flowing through a region of empty space with no charges at all present. No magnets either, just fields passing through. That's not bookkeeping, that's physics. So what's between the magnets is not a force reaching across nothingness, and not a ghostly substance either. It's a physical condition of space that evolves in time and can carry energy around independently. And once you swallow that, a much stranger question pops up. If this thing in space can carry energy and momentum, does it obey the same rules as everything else, or does it play by its own? At this point, people usually want to relax. They say, okay, fine, the field is real. Let's move on. But if you do that too quickly, you miss the most interesting part, because the moment you admit the field is real, you've promoted space from a passive backdrop to an active participant, and that has consequences. Here's one. The field itself can push on things, not just magnets and charges, but matter in general. Light hits a surface and exerts pressure, tiny but measurable. That means momentum is flowing through empty space and slamming into stuff. Momentum doesn't exist without something carrying it. You can't have just an effect delivering momentum. Something has to do the delivering. Another example, put energy into a magnetic field, then rearrange the setup so the field changes shape. You can feel stresses, coils try to expand, wires jump, engineers have to bolt things down in big machines because the fields tear at the hardware. Those forces aren't coming from the charges alone. They're coming from the field pushing on the charges that created it. So now the field is acting like a mechanical system, except with no gears. It has energy density, momentum density, and stress. In classical physics, anything with those features usually counts as real. But here's where the trouble sharpens. The field doesn't have a rest frame. Matter can sit still. A rock can be at rest on a table. The electromagnetic field doesn't have a natural at rest. Its disturbances propagate at a fixed speed no matter what you do. You can chase a light wave as hard as you want. You never catch up. This bothered people deeply. If waves move, what are they moving through? Water waves need water. Sound needs air. What does an electromagnetic wave need? The answer turned out to be deeply annoying. It needs nothing. That answer forces you to rethink motion itself. Because if the laws of the field are the same no matter how fast you're moving, then motion isn't something absolute. And that insight didn't come from thinking about trains or clocks first. It came from staring at equations about fields in empty space. A fellow named Albert Einstein took that seriously. He said, let's stop trying to imagine what the field is made of and instead accept what it does. It propagates at a universal speed. The equations don't care about your velocity. So maybe space and time have been lying to us about how separate they really are. But I don't want to run off into relativity just yet. There's a more immediate mystery still sitting between the magnets. If the field is real and it stores energy and it can push on things, then it ought to obey conservation laws all by itself. So suppose two magnets pull together. Energy decreases in the field. Where does it go? Suppose they push apart. Energy increases. Where does that energy come from? To answer that cleanly, we have to look at how the field itself keeps accounts. And once you do that, you find something even stranger hiding in plain sight. Let's do some honest bookkeeping, because physics always gets real when you insist on keeping the books straight. You have two magnets attracting each other. You hold them apart. Your muscles strain. That effort shows up as energy stored somewhere. Let go, and the magnets accelerate. Energy turns into motion. Fine. But notice something subtle. The magnets don't leap together instantly. The change in force propagates through space. That delay tells you the energy can't be jumping magically from one magnet to the other. It has to pass through the region between them. So we're forced to say the field itself contains energy, and it can gain or lose that energy locally. You can write down an energy density at each point in space. That's already strange enough. But now comes the part that people usually skip, because it's awkward to explain without symbols. When energy moves from one place to another, it flows, not teleports, flows. And flows have direction. That means you can ask a very concrete question. At this point in space, right now, which way is the energy going? It turns out you can answer that. There's a quantity that tells you the rate and direction of energy flow through space due to electric and magnetic fields. It's not an interpretation, it's measurable. You can test it in experiments. Energy really streams through empty space like traffic through an intersection. So now the space between the magnets isn't just sitting there storing energy, it's actively routing it, guiding it, redirecting it. That's a lot of responsibility for nothing. Here's a simple but unsettling example. You run current through a wire, powering a motor some distance away. Where does the energy go? Most people picture it flowing inside the wire, carried by electrons like water in a pipe. That picture is wrong. The electrons drift painfully slowly. If the energy waited for them, your motor would take minutes to respond. The energy flows mostly through the space around the wire, guided by the electromagnetic field. The wire just shapes the field and tells it where to go. The energy travels outside, then dives into the motor and turns into motion. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. The field is doing the heavy lifting. Matter is just along for the ride, nudging the field this way or that. Now we've crossed a line. The field is no longer a secondary character. It's the main actor. Charges and magnets create it, yes, but after that it evolves on its own and pushes back. So what is this thing, really? Is it more fundamental than matter? Or is matter more fundamental and the field is just a convenient summary of interactions? Here's where things get really uncomfortable. Because when you look closely, particles themselves start to look suspiciously like localized disturbances of fields, little knots in something spread out everywhere. That idea sounds abstract, but it has teeth. And if it's right, then asking what's between the magnets is the wrong question. The real question would be, what are the magnets themselves made of in the deepest sense? And to even ask that, we have to take one more step into strange territory. Now, we're far enough in that I can finally say something that would have sounded crazy at the start. Maybe the magnets aren't the primary objects at all. Think about how we usually tell the story. First there are particles, then they reach out and influence each other using fields, but that ordering was an assumption, not a discovery. It felt natural because particles look solid and local, while fields look spread out and fuzzy. But nature doesn't care what feels natural. Here's the crack in the old picture. An electron is supposed to be a little charged thing, a point, but the moment you ask where its energy is, most of it isn't at the point. It's in the electric field extending outward, spread across space. If you tried to squeeze all that energy into a tiny dot, the numbers blow up. Infinity. Nature usually uses infinity as a way of telling you you're thinking about it wrong. So maybe a particle isn't a tiny marble after all. Maybe it's a stable pattern in a field, a little persistent wiggle that behaves like a thing. Here's a simpler analogy. A wave on the ocean isn't a separate object floating on top of the water. It is the water arranged in a particular moving pattern. You can point to the wave, track it, measure its speed, even crash it onto a beach. But there's no extra wave substance beyond the water itself. Now don't push that analogy too far. It breaks if you lean on it. But it hints at a different way to think. What if electrons, magnets, all of it, are patterns in underlying fields? Then asking what's between the magnets becomes almost backwards. The magnets and the space between them are made of the same stuff. In modern physics, that's not philosophy. That's how the equations are written. Every type of particle corresponds to a field that exists everywhere. Even in empty space, what we call a particle is just a localized excitation of that field, the way a pluck on a string makes a traveling vibration. So when two magnets interact, it's not two solid objects whispering across a void. It's overlapping field patterns reshaping each other continuously. The force you feel is the system trying to rearrange itself into a lower energy configuration. This explains something that used to look mysterious. Why does the influence weaken with distance? Because the field disturbance spreads out. Why does it take time to respond? Because the rearrangement propagates. Why can energy move through empty space? Because empty space isn't empty in the way we thought. But now you should feel uneasy, because if fields are everywhere all the time, what does nothing even mean? And if space itself is filled with these possibilities for excitation, why doesn't it erupt into chaos? It doesn't. And that restraint is the final clue. To understand why, we have to talk about the quietest state a field can have. And that's where the story finally comes to rest. We've been dancing around the idea of nothing long enough. So let's face it directly. If fields are everywhere, then even when nothing seems to be happening, they still exist. They have a lowest energy state, a calm configuration. We call it the vacuum, which is an unfortunate word because it sounds like absence. It isn't absence. It's the ground state of the fields. Between the magnets, when they're far apart and doing nothing dramatic, the field is in a certain arrangement. Bring the magnets closer and that arrangement changes. Energy shifts from one place to another. The magnets move because the total system is sliding toward a more economical pattern. Less energy stored in the field, more in motion, or the other way around, depending on what you force it to do. So what's between the magnets is not a substance and not a ghost. It's the electromagnetic field itself in a particular state, real enough to store energy, real enough to carry momentum, real enough to obey conservation laws all by itself. And here's the final turn of the screw. Once you accept that, the question, what's between the magnets, stops being special. The same answer applies everywhere. What's between you and the wall? What's between atoms? What's between galaxies? Fields arranged differently, doing different things. The magnets don't reach across space. They don't send secret messages. They simply sit inside a field that already exists, and by their presence, they reshape it. The reshaping costs energy. The system responds. Motion happens. That's not mystical. It's brutally practical. It lets you calculate forces, predict radiation, build motors, and understand why light even exists at all. But it's also humbling, because it means the solid, tangible objects we're used to trusting are not the fundamental actors. They're patterns riding on something more spread out, more subtle, and more persistent than any chunk of matter. So the next time someone tells you there's a magnetic field between two magnets, don't stop there. Ask yourself what that field can do, what it can store, how it can move energy, how it can change in time. Because once you ask those questions honestly, you're no longer talking about magnets at all. You're talking about what reality is willing to be made of.